This is a Unity and Diversity Book Talk on The Dream Keepers by Gloria Ladson Billings, presented to you by me, Lauren Sweet.
Well, I read The Dream Keepers by Gloria Ladson Billings, and it talks about the successful teachers of African American children. And so today, I'm going to go ahead and talk about Gloria Ladson Billings. She was born in 1947 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and her elementary school consisted of about 700 students. And out of those 700 students, there was only one Caucasian family in their district, which I thought was really interesting, especially since I went to a predominantly Caucasian school. So definitely different cultures there between us. During this time period, desegregation and integration had just come about after the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education. So in middle school, Ladson Billings' parents sent her across town to a predominantly white school. They felt that their neighborhood was deteriorating and they wanted her to get the best education possible. Next, she graduated in 1965 and she went on to go to a historically black university, which is Morgan State University. And what hit me hard after this is she went on to teach at a predominantly white school. It was an urban school, and she faced a lot of racism. She was constantly referred to as the N-word, and it just was not a good experience for her. But as we'll talk about later, she developed relationships with her students in the community and earned their respect shortly after.
Ladson Billings' struggle in this society made me wonder, how can I educate my students on being sensitive to racial slurs and issues within the mathematics classroom? And that's where I came to this idea. One activity that you could do is ask the students to dress in attire that represents a specific year, like 500 BC, the year that Pythagoras lived. Then have students make positive comments about their peers' attire. This lesson will allow students to realize that what they're wearing may be from the same time period, but it may alter in appearance. This will teach students that although our skin color may not be the same, that we all have the same general needs, like love, safety, security, food, water, etc.
She then went on to get her master's at the University of Washington, and she got a PhD at Stanford, so she has a lot of credentials. Today, she's a pedagogical theorist. She's an author of journal articles, her bestseller. She is a breast cancer survivor, and she's a main contributor to the idea of cultural relativity, which is what her book focuses on. So you might want to write down cultural relativity. Her bestseller is The Dream Keepers, which is what I read, and it was published in 1994. However, there was a second edition, which is the one that I read, and that was published in 2009. Ladson Billings opens up her book with this quote, and basically it's saying that scholars look at African American students and try to figure out what's wrong. Is it their mind, their culture, their education, their families? However, she wants this book to be what is right with our African American students and what can we do to help them succeed.
So what are some ways we can focus on students being right in the math classroom? Well, instead of telling students what they are doing wrong when solving a system of equations, here are a few math steps that teachers can do to help students realize what they are doing correctly. First, have the student walk you through the steps to correct their work. Secondly, you could have the student teach another student. This allows peer revision, and the other student may be able to correct your student without having to call them out in front of the whole classroom. Number 3, use statements like, "You did so great, but let's look at this step," or "Great work, how do you think it looks?" This allows for the student to self-evaluate their own work.
And this is where the idea of cultural relativity comes about. This is the idea that a human's beliefs and activities should be understood in others in terms of their own culture. In Ladson Billings' opinion, in order to incorporate cultural relativity in our classrooms, we must have a conception of ourselves, of others. We must be able to develop social relations and have clear conceptions of knowledge. So some research you guys need to know about this book is that Ladson Billings went to Northern California and she labeled this town as Pinewood. It's not the actual town's name. And this town ranks among the poorest on every social and economic level. It has the highest unemployment and underemployment rates. The majority of the high school students drop out, and they are also the highest in the nation for teenage pregnancies. The teachers that were selected, there was 8 teachers selected, and Ladson Billings went up and she interviewed not only the teachers, she interviewed parents, and she interviewed principals to come up with this list. She ended up with 5 African American women, 3 Caucasian. The interesting thing is that none of them had less than 12 years of experience, which shows that practice makes perfect. And the classroom observations took place from September 1989 to June of 1991, and the book, remember, was published in 1994, so she did a lot more interviewing. I love this quote, and it helped me open my eyes. It says that each of the teachers realized there was a pivotal moment in their teaching career where they needed to reassess their work and to help students succeed. So the ISTE standard states that teachers should inspire student learning. And I think that in order to inspire student learning, we have to be able to look at what we're doing, evaluate what we're doing, and then implement it in a new strategy.
When creating my unit design for an 8th grade math class, I was actually able to implement this standard. I originally had an activity that introduced Pythagoras and his time period, and I allowed students to work in groups to create their own Pythagorville. Then they were able to present the similarities and differences from this time period and compare them to today. This was a great introduction to the Pythagorean theorem. However, when I found out that my studio school student Alyssa was interested in fashion design, I completely changed my activity to focus around her interests. I changed this activity because I wanted Alyssa to be interested in the activity and hoped it would increase her likelihood of learning the material. I've previously mentioned this activity on the previous slides, but basically, students will learn about the time period, present the similarities and differences as I mentioned. Only difference is that this time they will dress in the apparel from that time period, aka the togas that you are seeing in the picture above.
So the first point of cultural relativity is the conception of self and others. Teacher must see herself as an artist. Peggy Valentine is one of the teachers selected in my book, and she did something great. She wrote the word witch up on the board, and it was around Halloween time, and she asked her elementary students, give me some adjectives to describe this. So they started off with bad witch, ugly witch, and Miss Valentine was not really pleased with those responses, so every time they gave her a weak adjective, she would pretend to faint, or she would just fall on the ground. And she really was drastic and grabbed their attention. And then at the end, she actually got them to say things like ugly, green face, mole on nose witch, riding a broomstick everywhere witch. So they really enjoyed the activity, and that's because she grabbed their attention by being an artist and not just talking from a textbook. So next, the teacher must see herself as part of the community, and teaching is giving back to the community. Miss Devereaux did a really good job of this. She actually started a Girl Scout group, and she asked all her elementary students to come to her Girl Scouts. And I think that's a great way to incorporate teaching a community and being able to talk outside of the classroom. A teacher must believe that all students can succeed. There was something mentioned in the book about how a lot of times teachers are colorblind, and meaning this is they look at all students the same, which is a good concept. However, we do need to acknowledge that students have different cultural identities, and we need to recognize them in the classroom so that all students can succeed.
How can we avoid being colorblind in the classroom? First, we can allow opportunities for students to express themselves. This could be through art, music, or etc. Secondly, we can create projects that allow students to be creative and implement their culture into their work for the classroom. Third, whenever there is a controversial topic outside of the classroom, we can make sure to address it in the classroom. We don't want to try to avoid things by pushing it under the rug. Rather, we can address it in the class and teach students how to have a mature discussion.
So, teacher helps students make connections between their community, national, and global identities. And the teacher sees teaching as pulling out knowledge or developing on prior knowledge. The example I put here is our standards from Common Core. The first one, the AEE 7, talks about solving linear equations. And you are not going to be able to solve a linear equation if you didn't learn the fundamentals of math, which is multiplication, addition, subtraction, and that was discussed in 3081. My favorite part about developing self is a task that Elizabeth Harris had in her classroom. She had all of her students come sit in the middle of her classroom on a rug, and she would say, what are we going to do our best at today? Students would answer instructional things for math. For my example, they would say, I'm going to learn how to do my multiplication tables today. However, they might say, I'm going to raise my hand instead of just calling out an answer. So she made sure that they vocally said what their goals were for that day, and then she used quotes like, I just know you can do it, and, oh, you are? Well, that's great. And she really encouraged them. Next, we have conductors versus coaches, and I thought this was really important because there are 6 different types of teachers regarding African American students in inner city schools. And I'll go over a quick summary. So tutors believe that students can improve, but it's not their responsibility. It's up to the student to do all their work, or up to the parents. A general contractor believes that students can succeed in the classroom, but they give it to someone else. They say, it's not my problem, I'm going to get an aide to help them, or I'm going to move them into a different classroom. The custodians believe that not much can be done, and they don't do anything to help. They kind of just sweep the problems under the rug. Referral means not much can be done, but they're willing to help. They are willing to get the aids, get the technology and whatnot to get students to be able to succeed. Conductors believe that students are capable of excellence, and they assume responsibility for those students by working one-on-one with them, staying after school, getting a tutor. And coaches believe that the success is in the team. That means having students work together, and they believe they are a facilitator by giving different norms and different references for students. So the second part of Latson Billing Social Relativity is building social relations, which is probably my favorite part of this entire book. So the 4 points are teacher-student relationship exists beyond the interactions in the classroom. That means if you're at the grocery store, you see a kid, you say hey and wave and talk to them about something other than school. The teacher demonstrates a connectedness with all students. I think this is important that we sit down and have one-on-one time with our students and really get to know who they are and what they're doing. Teacher encourages a community of learners, and teacher encourages students to learn collaboratively. And students are supposed to urge each other and in a way be study buddies, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. So what is the role of the teacher? I think the first thing that I absolutely love for my math content is let the students teach. So trade seats with them. There was actually an example in the book where one of the teachers took their student's seat, sent them up to the front, and then started asking questions as if they were a student. So in math, this is especially a good idea to have a problem on the board and have your student come up and write the solution on the board, and you ask questions. So that way, if they can teach it, you know that they know it, and they can test it. Be their extended family, get parents involved, and get involved in the community, all kind of go together. It's just talking about don't be so stern in your classroom to where you can't go out into the community and get along with your students' friends or your parents within the community. Take them to lunch was really interesting, and I'm pretty sure you're not supposed to do what she did. So Hillard, what she would do is she had 4 to 5 students, and she would take them out of their lunch, and they would grab it, come back to her room, and they would just talk, play games, talk about what they enjoyed. And however, there is actually, I believe, a law that says you were supposed to give each student 30 to 40 minutes without communication with their teachers and being in a classroom. And she knew how important it was to have communications and to have relationships, that she did it anyways. So get to know them. Rossi was actually a Catholic nun, and she was Caucasian, and she went to go teach at a predominantly African-American school, and so she knew they weren't going to have a lot in common, so she created a questionnaire the first day of school, had her students answer it, and then she developed her lessons plans based off what the students enjoyed. That way she could get as much connectedness with them. We're all in this together. So Latson Billing says that cultural relevant students, they need to be able to work together, and if they can't understand that they can achieve success with someone, then the idea of cultural relativity won't necessarily work in the classroom. So I believe it's important that we need to build a relationship between our students. We're going to have our students for a year. They're going to develop relationships with their classmates that last a lifetime. So if we can encourage those types of relationships, we'll definitely see success in the classroom. And I put a minefield example. Went to the Boys and Girls Club, and we had paper balls that we threw into the middle of a grid. And we had one student that was blindfolded, and she was trying to get to the other side of the minefield, without stepping on any pieces of paper. What's so interesting about this, though, is that her teammates had to coach her through the minefield. And anytime she stepped on a mine, she'd have to go back to the beginning. So what's important about this is the beginning of the lesson was really frustrating because they didn't know how to communicate with each other. But letting them work through some problems together, they were able to get everyone across successfully. The third part of cultural relativity is conception of knowledge. So knowledge is continuously recycled, reinvented, and shared by teachers and students. Knowledge is viewed critically. Teachers passionate about content. If you can't stand up in the front of the classroom and show that you care about what you're doing, your students are going to feed off of that, and they're not going to have that same passion, and they're never going to have it instilled in them. Teacher helps students develop necessary skills, and teacher takes student diversity and individual differences into account. As far as developing the necessary skills in a math class, if you don't know how to add numbers, you're never going to be able to move on to multiplication, because multiplication is just addition, multiple parts. So some notes to remember is language is recycled and recreated almost daily. Hilliard did something that I also worked on with the Boys and Girls Club, and she talked about how she wanted her students to understand that your cultural language isn't wrong, but there is a more proper language we need to use for our resumes and our writing. I did this experiment, and I think I talked to you guys about it, when I had the Wheel of Fortune game, and we played with what I refer to as Ebonics, talking about culture. And so it's really important that students understand that their language is not necessarily wrong, but there's appropriate times and places for it. So be passionate about your content. Make sure you get excited. If you have to act, try to act. Build on prior knowledge, no worksheets. Rossi had a student who was extremely gifted, and she would have them all sit down and work on an assignment, and one of her students finished several minutes before the others and started to run around and disrupt the classroom. And so instead of giving him a worksheet, she gave him a more advanced problem where he had to work with his hands. It's almost like a puzzle piece, and he had to work with his hands rather than just sitting there and being bored. She let him expand on his knowledge. Make learning fun. It's pretty self-explanatory. Come up with ideas and creative ways to get your students involved. And give in-class recognition to out-of-class excellence. So if you know one of your students has a basketball game on the weekend and they did really well, recognize that in the classroom. It doesn't always have to be academic excellence. It could also be physical, educational, anything. So how do we get motivated teachers? Find teachers who desire to work with African American students. Indulge them into the culture. Provide educational experiences that will help them understand the role of the culture. Provide teacher candidates with opportunities to critique the system. This has to do a lot with choosing the textbooks. A lot of these teachers that I've actually mentioned did not actually teach directly from their textbooks because they knew their students didn't need that, so they found other ways to educate their students to do well in testing. Require teacher candidates to have prolonged immersion in African American culture, provide opportunities for observations, and conduct student teaching over a long period of time, which is what we're going to be doing in the fall. So when she wrote this book, they may have only observed a certain amount of hours, but today, we get to go a whole semester, so we're really lucky to have that privilege. So what would the culturally relevant school look like? I think first, it would provide educational self-determination. This just means we're going to build up the self-esteem of our students, and we're going to let them learn on their own. A culturally relevant school would honor and respect the students' home culture. So that doesn't mean they might not be the most gifted, but we can definitely respect their home culture and even incorporate that into our learning. And lastly, help African American students understand the world as it is. Let them know that there are problems and there are struggles, and that racism in some ways does still exist, but that we can overcome those and that we can succeed in our futures. Some interesting facts. Out of the 20 largest schools in the nation, the African Americans took up 70% of that population. The more interesting fact is that out of the same population, only 5% of the teachers were African American. The highest school dropout rate in New York and California is 35%, and inner city schools it's 50%. Starkville High School is 74% African American. Oh, that's actually supposed to be 64, sorry. There's 64% African American. African Americans are 3 times more likely to drop out, and this was a statistic noted by Bray. And then this is the one that hit me really hard when I was doing this, is that more African American males are in control of the criminal justice system than are enrolled in college. And that's where I think that we can make a difference. There's a really good quote. It's not by Martin Luther King. I just put him up there because he's great. I'm only one, but I am one. I cannot do everything, but I can do something. And I think that applies to us as teachers. We might not have all the answers. We would not be able to walk with our students every day, but if we can make one small difference and another teacher makes one more small difference, we can change the culture in society. And so in closing, I want you guys to know that we can incorporate cultural relativity in our classrooms through the conception of ourselves and of others, between relationships with others, and having a clear conceptions of knowledge. And that's it.
I'd like to give a special thanks to Dr. Brocato's MacBook for recording this presentation, and I'd also like to give a shout out to the EDF 4243 Planning for Diverse Learners course of the spring 2015 for an awesome semester. Hope you guys all have a great summer.